So today we're seeing a big struggle with critical media literacy education and also avenues of independent media's survivability under global capitalism. Over the last couple decades, we've seen corporate media consolidate their messaging and filter down a lot of things that used to be avenues for independent journalism to thrive and survive and to sustain itself. But I think corporate media systematically it fails as an institution under capitalism because it exists to prop up the narratives that mythologize capitalism and which accompanies, U.S. empire, U.S. imperialism, and propping up the same institution that essentially acts to dictate to us what the truth and reality is. And unfortunately, when that's coming from the top down, under a media system that's subsidized by the very corporate entities that journalism should be exposing, which is, the defense industry, banking, oil, food. I mean, all of these things that are essential components of our lives to understand how they all intertwine with the system that we live in. They are all subsidized by the very agency that should be investigating them. So investigative journalism is essentially non-existent. It's very hard to get the funding for alternative journalism to investigate corruption within political systems, to critique capitalism. And so, unfortunately, it exists the way it is today, where a lot of journalism students kind of are berated with the notion of neutrality. And for me, I'm an advocacy journalist. And so the concept of neutrality for me is really non-existent, and it's kind of cartoonish when you're looking at the way that corporate media operates, six corporations dictating everything that we see, hear, and read, 90% of everything that we see, hear, and read. And I wear my advocacy and my bias on my sleeve. And so take me as I come. And I can circumvent the biases that I'm working with, whether it be Russia Today or Telesur in the past, where I went to those networks to tell the truth about my country, because corporate media doesn't give you the avenues to do so. Everyone has an opinion. It's just a matter of how are you going to express those opinions under the authority of someone else and using those as references and sources. That is why a free press is so essential and so difficult in this system. Really, our free press is diminishing more and more, whether it's a journalist like Julian Assange being charged with treason and espionage for simply publishing leaks, which is the founding principle of what every publication should do, exposing war crimes, or whether it's something like the shrinking avenues of funding for alternative media to survive and to report on real issues and to expose the powers that be and to also uplift grassroots voices. As an independent journalist, as someone who's paved my own way outside of the system and charted kind of another territory that a lot of other independent journalists have done that are focusing on issues of US foreign policy and, uplifting activist voices, I think that's what instructs me the most is going to uh, these fights and struggles, the front lines of people who are putting their bodies on the lines, people who are really dedicating themselves to the cause of change, and linking these struggles together, understanding that we have a common enemy, and it all connects. True independent grassroots media and linking and uplifting each other's voices is the most crucial thing that we can do for change, because without an avenue to tell these stories, no one's going to hear them. And we have to reveal that, right? We have to reveal that, and we have to keep showing the truth on the ground and the reality on the ground if we want to sustain change and provide a viable future.
I do think independent media is enormously important. A truly independent alternative media, free of the massive biases that come in from government ownership or corporate sponsorship or ownership of the outlets, is absolutely crucial. And all you have to do is check to see how alternative media covers different sources and different topics and compare it with establishment media. You can do that, for instance, by looking at Project Censored's top 25 list of most censored stories every year. So often, the ones that make it there, they are covered by small independent outlets with relatively few resources. And yet the establishment media just completely ignores them. And it's because there are structural factors which completely prevent establishment media from covering certain topics properly in a way. And very often the best journalists in the United States start their careers in establishment media, but are essentially hounded out of that profession and forced into the margins. Just take one example, Chris Hedges, for example. He was a Middle Eastern bureau chief for the for the New York Times for many years. But after he criticized the United States invasion of the Iraq War in 2003, he was essentially forced out of his position. And from there, he traveled the wilderness for many years and is still doing so, working in foreign media outlets or trying to work in very niche, small websites like Truthdig. And so we really have a terrible situation here when journalists calling out one of the greatest crimes of the 21st century, if they do so, they are kicked out of the profession and marginalized for the rest of their career. A truly independent media, unfortunately, very often we don't have very much money because we don't have billionaire backers or governmental assistance. That's because those sorts of people really don't want the system that they benefit from being scrutinized too much. So we are really being deliberately starved of funding. But we really do need this. And when I say we, I don't just mean journalists, I mean everyone in society, because corporate media is really the mouthpiece of corporate America. They always make sure to present news in a way that is favorable for corporate shareholders and advertisers. But the big news of the day rarely makes them look good. And so we are left with a sort of fettered, mothballed media, which only covers the most important topics in a very surface level way, leading to a complete lack of understanding of some of the most important topics in society. Likewise, we need to hold the government to account, and very often alternative media can do that much better than establishment media, which relies on things like access journalism and their connections to the powerful people, connections that alternative media pretty much as a rule do not have.
I think if we kind of go back in time and look at the development of what became, known as the press and then the free press, was this idea of talking back to public officials, talking back to those in power, really making sure that the people, the rest of us, were able to understand what was happening. And I think that's a really valuable and important ideal that might not be held up by corporations, right? By the establishment or the legacy press, because who they're answering to, who the journalists are often answering to, are those corporate powers, right? So a truly free and independent press is able to look into things with, one hopes, fewer restrictions, fewer boundaries on what might be hot or what might be popular right now, and more about maybe what regular people need to know, deserve to know, and want to know. If I can give a particular example, I think of, the Washington Post, which I think the Washington Post has done some great journalism, right? If we kind of go back in time and look at the Pentagon Papers and look at its coverage of Vietnam, there was some really deep investigative work. But when we move forward in time, the Washington Post is owned by Jeff Bezos, who owns Amazon, who owns Whole Foods. So just as a slice of what could be missing, you're never going to read an article in the Washington Post that is, say, critical of Amazon's labor practices, or critical of Whole Foods labor practices, or quite frankly, Whole Foods prices in this time of inflation, when good old fashioned regular people can't afford really to shop at Whole Foods. And yet, because it's such a corporate behemoth, it can kind of come in and take out the mom and pop shops that might have been more affordable, or drive those prices up too, because I would imagine their rents go up. We're not going to read about that, right? That means that we're missing information. Right. And that means that we're missing information from the newspaper that originates in the nation's capital. We could be reading that newspaper, any newspaper, cover to cover, but if all of the stories are going to have to answer to a corporate power, reading it cover to cover every single day means that we're still missing information.
I think what 48 years of Project Censored's research into important but underreported news stories shows is that without an independent press, there are a host of systemic social issues, and there are important, newsworthy, vital perspectives that are simply omitted altogether or marginalized or obscured or treated in only a partial way by the corporate media. So put another way, I think independent news media act as a check on the otherwise unrestrained power of the corporate media to influence public opinion. I also think that independent news media, insofar as they cover topics and they treat as newsworthy sources that are ignored or marginalized by the corporate press, they have an agenda-setting function on the corporate press. So independent news outlets cover stories that then garner public attention and force the corporate media to move in the direction of an actual mainstream role.
Well, it's absolutely essential for any society, but particularly for democratic societies, to have a strong independent press. That means independent of government control, but it also means independent of corporate control as well. And if media are beholden to corporate interests, how are we ever going to expect them to do the type of investigative work that we want them to do? So I'll just give you an example. You know, Jeff Bezos owns Amazon, which plays a huge role in, in our society and, distribution of all kinds of products now, but also Amazon Web Services and control of the internet. He also owns the Washington Post. And so how much can we really expect the Washington Post to report critically on Jeff Bezos and what's happening at Amazon? Years ago, a sociologist named, I think it's Herbert Gans, I'm drawing a blank on his first name, but his last name was Gans, wrote a great book called Fear and Favor in the Newsroom, where he did an ethnography of major news industries and really kind of revealed the limitations and the self-censorship that journalists working for corporate industries often felt like they had to be careful about what they could or couldn't say, who they could or couldn't interview. And so if we are to have a thriving democracy, it really is important that we have a very strong, publicly funded, the money has to come from somewhere. You can't do journalism without a budget. It's going to have to come from somewhere, but when it comes from corporations, when it comes from advertising, that puts too much of a restriction on what could possibly be said. And so we have to have much more publicly funded media infrastructure if we're really going to hope to survive as a democracy in the United States and in other places around the world. This is also true internationally for all societies. And in societies that are captured by authoritarian governments, maybe it's even more important, but also more difficult, because then everything has to happen underground.
I think that holding power to account is paramount to this work. Within Weave News, we are constantly trying to challenge these narratives by empowering voiceless people and empowering ordinary people to tell their own stories. And so we lean a lot into citizen journalism, and through citizen journalism, our contributors and everyone on the staff at Weave News is able to develop these skills, and it's an ongoing learning process, right? There's not really a finish line. We're constantly learning how to be critical and how to challenge these narratives, because the narratives are changing as quickly as anything else, and the news changes on a daily basis. But holding power to account in these new spaces is one of the only tools we have to do so. And if we're not supporting our free press and supporting independent media, we're not challenging power. And then power is left to do whatever it wants to do. And it's left to make the world a more difficult place for us to live in. And that's just not something people should be willing to accept.
I know this is not a short answer, but I want to answer this way. One of my current projects is about the NYPD, the New York Police Department. Everybody would understand that, police, I think it shouldn't be a controversial idea that police should be an institution that the public should have some accountability over, since we are the ones being policed. There's an institution that's supposed to do that kind of review of the police, and it's called the Civilian Review Board in New York. But that Civilian Review Board answers to the police commissioner. So they can do all these investigations, they can prove all these things, but in the end, if the police commissioner doesn't like it, which they most often don't, they'll just reject whatever they recommend. So now let's think about our media, right? What if our media is, trying to report on issues of power to do with, who's creating the climate crisis, who is responsible for, different forms of what is called political corruption, or just a normal oppressive political operation, issues of sexual assault, right? But what if the very people who are actually controlling the media, right, are the people doing those things or participating or complicit in those things? It's going to be very hard for the media to report on those things. And there's been a lot of research that has shown that through not always like direct censorship, but just through what gets allowed to be covered and what isn't, that those things are influenced by, the fact who funds the media and who runs it. So we don't have a free press, and we can't get the information we need to hold institutions accountable. And I guess the big question is, if you don't really have a press that can report on power in a serious way, are you actually in a democracy?
The corporate counterparts in the mainstream media, if we want to call it that, are quite often well-trained professionals who understand a great deal about the world and about how things work, but no matter how much they try to apply a professional standard of ethics and how much they attempt to be independent, they are still working for corporations whose main job is not to serve audiences, but to serve advertisers. And so even the best of the journalists are often caught in, I won't say conflict of interests, but they're caught in situations in which there are conflicting pressures, and certain perspectives are inevitably going to be minimized in the system as a whole. I think there are good examples of professional journalists working for mainstream media here and there, and occasionally able to present truly critical perspectives. But it's not the rule. As a rule, critical perspectives are marginalized, and most people who don't pay attention to the news all day, every day, working people who have, work to do, aren't going to end up being exposed to those perspectives very frequently. And this is why it's important to have what you're calling a truly free press. I might use different words because I think that implies an idealistic notion of what the free press can really be. I really like Stanley Fish's analysis of what a free press really means. His famous article that says there's no such thing as freedom of speech, and it's a good thing too, is quite important. Freedom of speech is a very valuable thing. Of course, everybody likes freedom of speech and everybody wants it, but the idea that speech or the press or the media can be free in some kind of absolute sense is not helpful ultimately, because no matter what kind of institution a journalist or a reporter or an editor or a producer is working in, there will always be material constraints on what they're doing. There will always be reasons why they need to do one thing rather than another. And in that sense, what we need is an alternative to the corporate mainstream media that is free from those particular pressures, but everybody who is in the audience, everybody who reads or hears or watches the content that's produced, always needs to understand that what they're watching is not some kind of truly free reporting that gives the absolute truth. every perspective, every news content is always going to come from some perspective. And real media literacy is about understanding how to recognize the perspective behind what you are seeing or hearing or reading. And so an independent press is important, but I think we need to understand that as the importance of a system that provides a variety of different perspectives. I live in Canada, and we have what is more clearly a mixed system where there is significant public ownership of media. And the publicly owned media is not perfect at all. I think it does, in general, a better job than the privately owned media industries, although its TV network carries advertising as well, so it is not free from that perspective. But one aspect of media literacy in a country like that is to understand why there is a difference between what comes from private sector media and what comes from publicly owned media. So if you understand that, you're more media literate, and it allows you to cope better with different perspectives, and you can perhaps then also see what's missing from both. And if we had different kinds of media sectors that had different funding bases, perhaps things that were more tied to local communities, things that were in some way nonprofit, but not in the hands of a centralized state, we might see more perspectives. And of course, the more perspectives we see, the better we're able to put together our own picture of the world and make sense of the world in a way that meets our own interests.
I think we know that because of some of the shifts in the capitalist mediascape, there are fewer and fewer journalists who are actually paid to do good investigative work, good local work, good work checking out our government officials at the school board, local, national, and international levels. So that's a real concern. The other thing is that those who are there are more and more subject to a speed up. They have to produce more and more news very quickly. They don't have the time to actually provide the in-depth kind of reporting that's necessary for us to understand the complexity of the world in which we live. And the other thing is that they are often subject to the directions of their corporate bosses to be able to produce news that's sensational, that will drive eyeballs to their sites, will capture people's attention rather than will provide information that is key for people to survive. So we need people that are not beholden to corporate power, to use a shorthand, that have the interests of the public first, have the interests of investigating what's going on first, and that take the time to understand the larger context in which every story resides.
The corporate journalists, I don't even really like calling them journalists, are stenographers for the State Department. There are literally, I mean, and the outlets themselves admit to this. You know, the New York Times checks in with the CIA or the State Department, checks in with them with regards to a story. The propagandization includes a very tight relationship, by necessity, of the state apparatus and the media. And by that, of course, the corporations that own our government. So when you don't have the ability for people outside of that purview to discuss what's happening, then you don't have the ability to learn about what's actually going on from the perspective of somebody who wants to look critically at our government. So a free press is necessarily an adversarial press. It is necessarily a press that holds power to account. You can't have that if you're a stenographer for the State Department. If you just say, yes, sir, thank you for my copy, sir. That's not a free press. And so corporate media, you know, the same people that show you ads for Lockheed Martin and Boeing, cannot possibly be where we look to find out what's actually going on in our name. We have to look to people like Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. And of course, this is why Julian Assange is being persecuted, because he dared take the facade off of empire. And that's why a lot of corporate media that even used what he gave them, what he released via WikiLeaks are not coming to his aid. And if they are saying anything, it's too little too late, really. And so the importance of a free press, the importance of independent journalists, is they allow us to see what's actually going on. And going back to that first point, they provide us with the lens to really see what's happening, and to really go to where I don't call them voiceless because nobody is voiceless, the silenced, to go to where the silenced are and uplift their stories and their voices, because they will never be questioned and they will never be asked to give their perspective and their input. And I think that's the core thing here. Is there's no such thing as objective journalism. I know that, again, as an academic, I haven't been in these classes, but I've heard about it, that a lot of journalism classes will talk about the importance of being, objective. That's impossible. We are subjective beings. And so what you can only do is understand your angle, right? So let's say that it's raining outside. Well, of course, that's a weather report. That's not journalism. What is your angle? Are you going to go and talk to the millionaire who now can't have his party on his yacht because it's raining? Or are you going to go talk to the unhoused people whose possessions are being destroyed and have nowhere to go because of the rain and a potential flash flood? And are you going to link that to climate change? What are your angles? And so I think that is what independent journalism allows us to have, are the angles that are not ever shared or uplifted in corporate media.
A lot of people think that journalists are these intrepid, dogged defenders of the truth, and they're out there, to do a service on our behalf. But the reality is that corporate journalists come from affluent backgrounds. They are trained at the most prestigious, wealthy, private institutions. They are not trained they are intentionally dissuaded from asking questions that hold power to account. They are part of the system of power. They are involved in it, they are enmeshed in it, they come from it. So they aren't equipped, either out of their own personal interest to keep the status quo as it is, or even if they want to, the way that they're trained with the background they come from, it does not permit them to do their job. Another thing that I should add is that, not surprisingly, most corporate journalists their way of thinking is more pro-corporate, pro-business. Their views on economic matters are definitely conservative. Maybe they might be more towards the center when it comes to social issues, perhaps. But, so this is where the importance of truly independent, muckraking, dissident, independent journalists come in, because they're going to do that hard work, that crucial work that corporate journalists aren't going to do. And just as an aside, we know that in the rare instances when corporate talking heads or journalists actually go out and do their job, well, they're punished for it. Gary Webb is the best example of that. He reported on the CIA bringing drugs into U.S. inner cities, and they ruined his life. Phil Donahue's another example, but there are many. So in my view, we need independent journalists. We need them funded somehow to do this work, separate from the existing power structures that exists.
Independent journalism is critically important because independent journalism is an umbrella that accompanies all sorts of different journalists who are looking to cut against the grain. When we look at big media and the way the media works today, the big brands, the big corporations, obviously big brands, big corporations, big money means very clear entrenched interests behind it. People who oftentimes have a lot of reason why they might want a certain story to come out or be reported a certain way, or are looking to, skew the timeline in order to not affect political events. Independent journalism throughout the history of this country in the United States. You think about, for instance, the abolitionist press, which is really maybe the first big independent journalism enterprise. All the mainstream press was for slavery, was reporting and using ads of fugitive slaves to make money. And so you had to have an independent independent alternative source to start to look at how you humanize the African American population in this country, how you put forward the various ills of slavery so people can know. And all throughout time, we've seen it, whether we're talking about the Vietnam War, the Korean War, whether we're talking about the reporters during World War II who were reporting on how big companies were profiteering off of various different war contracts and all the different pieces, whether we're talking right down here to today when you look at, say, a crisis like East Palestine, where you had the train derail and people were poisoned by the tens of thousands. And it's turned out now that none of this was necessary, that it wasn't scientifically relevant, that the big corporation, train corporation, was lying about what was taking place. That was all independent journalists. So people who basically survive on the basis of you and I, average everyday people, giving them small amounts of money, supporting their small publications, but because of that have the fearlessness and aren't tied down by the same sort of entrenched interests to look at the critical stories, the hard stories, in the way that they have to be looked at, in a way that can actually illuminate what's going on.
Having critically media literate journalists is essential for our society because they're the ones that are shaping and investigating what is going on in the world. They are our gatekeepers into what we should be thinking about. And if they're not questioning people in power about their decision making, if they are not questioning major corporations that affect not just what we buy, but also how we live as these major corporations shape policy, we will never have an informed public. So we need those journalists who, I understand in corporate media there are fine journalists and they are working under these corporate constraints, these corporate deadlines that work against them doing their jobs. And so if we have independent journalists who are free from those constraints, we can have better investigative journalism that better informs our public so we can then make better decisions for a better tomorrow.